I'm going to actually go into the first three things I talked about. And I want you guys to know that the stuff that we see in DeFi and Web3 is not really, it's not really as new as you think it is. Like, it's really just a aggregation of human behavior, but at this time it just so happens to be logged immutably on a immutable decentralized ledger. So I want you guys to understand that things like what you see today on blockchains does not directly imply that it's completely an unrelated phenomenon. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is wildcat banking. So you guys might not be aware of it, but the majority of Web3 projects today are engaging in wildcat banking. If you do any project and you issue a instrument, you're actually engaging in banking. You are engaging in banking. You might not think you're engaging in banking, but you're still engaging in banking. You might not realize you're engaging in banking, but you're engaging in banking. You have now opened a bank. You might not be aware of this at all, but the reason you're doing a bad job at it is because you don't understand that you're engaging in banking. Wildcat banking refers to the exact same process that you see now today in the DLT space, but it was happening in the 19th century during the free banking era of the United States. And this was specifically between the, I want to say, you can say it was between 1830 and 1870 specifically. Now I want you guys to understand that in the United States, in the middle of this era, there was also a gold rush in California. Does that make sense? And this was directly related to wildcat banking. There was a gold rush and enough people, you know, Seabiscuit, you're not wrong. There was a gold rush, and when news of this came to the East Coast, specifically in New York City and stuff like that, there was a lot of speculative investment happening. I'm going to cut more into that later, but first I'm going to talk about how wildcat banking went. So there wasn't a central bank. Does that make sense? The United States of America had no central bank. What they had was a bunch of chartered banks, and these chartered banks were basically private banks that effectively were chartered by the state they were in. But the fact of the matter is that they didn't really have any type of regulatory body or any type of way to figure out what was a real bank and what wasn't. So people were kind of spreading out west in the United States at this time, and a lot of people were living on the frontier. And people would show up in these frontier towns, and they would say that they were a banker opening a branch in a main city. Does that make sense? So let's say you were in Grand Junction, Colorado, and a banker would show up and say he was from Denver and he was going to open up a bank there. Now, all he had to prove that was he had the paperwork and the stationery that said he was from Denver. And what he would say is that all of the miners there, they could safely deposit, they could give him gold and silver, and he would in turn take that money. He would take the gold and silver to a depositorium over in Denver. He would vault it over in Denver, and he would instead give them banknotes. Does that make sense? He would give them paper certificates, literally circulating currency, to basically in exchange for the gold and silver they had deposited at this bank. Now the fact of the matter is that lots of people were pretending to be part of a bank and they weren't. They were in fact just brandjacking a larger bank. So they were effectively just defrauding people and circulating a whole bunch of worthless banknotes. Does that make sense? So banks were just collapsing left and right. I want to say there was like 700 banks spinning up in this era. Like 700 different banks were founded and crashed all in these few decades. Now, additionally, anytime a new bank was started, whether or not the founders had good intentions, they had no idea what they were doing. they didn't understand that their job or what the job of a banker was. They didn't really understand this at all, and therefore, even without fraud, there was a significantly high rate of failure. Tendai asked me how many blazers I have. I have enough blazers to keep you guessing, sir. That's how many blazers I have. Okay. So, gold and silver was getting taken from these either incompetent or fraudulent people, and banknotes were given back to them. Now, the banknotes and their exchange rates were normally considered to be backed by a certain amount of specie, but the fact of the matter is, there was always a higher amount of circulating banknotes than there was of gold and silver. And this has to do with something called the time value of money. Blazer swap, indeed. Time value of money. And you guys, I might have seen me write that acronym before. Okay, so does everyone understand? Wildcat banking is just people engaging in unqualified banking. Does that make sense? They don't have fiduciary responsibility. They don't understand how to manage debt or the circulation of debt and credit. They don't think about this at all. Are there any questions about wildcat banking is? And this happened in a wildcat banking era in the United States between 1830 and 1870. For those of you who have read the entirety of the Pyreswap roadmap, there is actually a project, or should I say there's a phase, where Pyreswap's NFT collection, which is known as Marashu, it's actually known as the Great Marashu's Family Tree, is we have this NFT collection called the Marashu collection. Marashu was an old banking family in Sumeria. I want to say Assyria, so I want to say like 1000 BC. I don't know, like Bronze Age, like ancient history. Does that make sense? Anyways, Marashu directly translates in that language to wildcat. So there is multiple layers of this word. Marashu means wildcat. Hilariously, they later on in America referred to this behavior as wildcat banking, describing the way that cougars behaved in the West. Does that make sense? Yeah, there's multiple layers of poetry here. But yeah, that's what wildcat banking is. Now, additionally in Web3, let me tilt this to get some glare off the thing there. Additionally in Web3, we have things called paper railroads. You guys might not know what a paper railroad is, but I like talking about paper railroads because paper railroads are how you can describe an infrastructure project that doesn't yet exist. So you guys are aware that there was a gold rush happening during the free banking era. Sorry, there's a wall of text in chat that was not related to this show. And, okay. Paper railroads. And I'm actually going to pull up paper railroads now. In the United States, a paper railroad is a company in the railroad business that exists on paper only as a legal entity which does not own any track, locomotives, or rolling stock. Okay? In the early days of railroad construction, paper railroads had to exist by necessity while in the financing stage. It allowed incorporation of a company in the seeking of capital to build a proposed railroad. In the 1850s, speculation of stock of paper railroads became rampant, causing a bubble of their stocks. This led in part to the Panic of 1857. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, the specific connotation of the phrase paper railroad was consistent, a proposed, speculative, and sometimes wildly speculative venture in which a company's stock exists, but no physical assets exist to run a railroad. Okay? In many cases, these railroads still existed as corporate entities long after plans to build them had been scrapped. Do you guys know about Western Union? Did you guys know that Western Union started off as a railroad? Yeah, and now they are effectively a banking system. Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like maybe they were a railroad that got so good at raising money that they realized that there's more money in finance than there is in railroads. Yeah. Did you guys know about that? You guys ever heard of Western Union? There's Western Union in multiple continents. Yeah. In contrast, anyways, can you guys think of anything in Web3 that's a parallel to what I'm describing here with paper railroads? When you guys engage in a pre-sale, or if there's ever like venture capital behind something, this is a paper railroad. I like calling them paper railroads because when you talk about Web3 infrastructure, you talk about new chains being built. Indeed, Electronic and ICO would be one as well. But when I think about paper railroads, I think about the fact that you're kind of talking about an infrastructure project, meaning you're probably raising money for a new chain or a new project or a new bridge or something new that's definitely going to connect where money is to where value is. Does that make sense? An example of what paper railroading was doing in this era is that you would have these mountain men get like bust into New York. Does that make sense? And there would be like one guy that was just touring these mountain men throughout New York City. And they would go visit all the banks, and they would have these cowboys sit there and tell them about how they have silver mines in Colorado, and they've got silver mines in Nevada, and they've got gold mines in California, and they've got gold mines in Oregon, right? And then basically they would raise a bunch of capital, they would go out west, and they were never heard from again. Does that make sense? Like they would just get New York banks to finance them, and they had no idea how to build a fucking railroad. Does that make sense? Yeah, like building railroads in this era was extremely difficult work. Yeah, they did not have cranes. They were doing it all by hand. Yeah, they were doing it all by hand. Like they didn't have excavators. They didn't have things that they could, move the land around like we do now, right? They couldn't cut into mountains, not really very well. They would have to tunnel through like a mine, but even that was pretty risky. So wildcat banking, paper railroads, and the last part of this era that I think is super important: hard times tokens. Hard times tokens. Can you guys guess what hard times tokens are? I actually own one of these, and I just have no idea ever where it is. I have it somewhere safe, obviously. Hard times tokens are American large or half-cent sized copper or brass tokens struck from about 1833 through 1843, serving as unofficial currency. These privately made pieces comprising merchant, political, and satirical pieces were used during a period of political and financial crisis in the United States. So, President Andrew Jackson abolished the second bank. Now, the fact of the matter is that when he abolished the second bank, he didn't really have this phasing out period. Does that make sense? He kind of just like yanked the plug. Does that make sense? So the monetary supply was kind of questionable about who was actually redeemable for what. And they ended up with these tokens getting circulated, which, by the way, this is a picture of Andrew Jackson holding, he's over a chest full of gold, and the inscription says, "I take the responsibility." And this is meant to mock him, because they're basically parodizing him, saying that like while he takes the responsibility of the financial crisis, he has in fact no idea what he's doing. There you go, Seabiscuit. So a hard times token was the original meme token. Do you guys understand? Like this was the fact. These hard times tokens were just issued by people that wanted to parodize the president. Does that make sense to you guys? Like they were just like propaganda tokens saying, wow, this guy's dumb, right? Because the system they had before, Andrew Jackson was trying to solve banking problems, that the problems that bank was causing, but the abrupt nature from the way he ended the second bank in the United States to the public, it caused a more abrupt problem, which made them think he was in fact trying to hurt them, or in fact was you get what I'm saying. A good parallel was the way that Joe Biden ended the Afghanistan war. Does that make sense? I think while most people agree that the Afghanistan war was due for ending, there was perhaps some issues with the execution of it that perhaps could have been done smoother. Do you guys understand the parallel that I'm describing there? Okay. Fantastic. So that right there is just what I want to talk about for wildcat banking, paper railroads, and hard times tokens. And I'm going to immediately turn this into what we talk about when we talk about a ledger economy, because I want to explain what you actually need for a ledger economy to work. And this again just goes back to the theory of an intergame. And when we talk about a ledger economy, I want you guys to understand that we're talking about like an infrastructure for an economy. An infrastructure for an economy. Now, a railroad is a great way to think about an infrastructure for an economy, because that's sort of the way a blockchain works. A blockchain, again, a sequence of blocks, which is more or less just like a ledger, but at the same time, it has things like addresses. Does that make sense? So if you can imagine, we have this railroad, and the thing about a railroad is that everywhere a railroad is laid, it's always there. Does that make sense? I mean, you can change tracks on a railroad, but generally when they're installed, they're considered pretty permanent. Does that make sense to you guys? A blockchain is pretty parallel to that. It's pretty similar. Once it's there, it's pretty permanent. Now, a railroad, especially when done over a long distance, is meant to connect a point A to a point B. But on a blockchain, we have infinitely, like, you know, not infinite, but like an innumerable amount of locations. So you'll have all of these little stops. I guess I should do it like that. Does that make sense? And you have C, D, E, and F. A blockchain is really something that addresses use to go between each other. Does that make sense? You have a network of addresses and the chain that connects them all. The infrastructure, meaning the way that they're all connected. Now, what's interesting about a blockchain is that all the locations are functionally equal in distance from each other. Does that make sense to you guys? So everywhere on a chain is the same distance from each other. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? Because it's just a part of the code. In theory, there could be variation here, but like not enough to actually consider. But on a train track, it's a little bit different, right? Obviously, C and D or A and C are closer than A and E, right? But arguably, it's the same thing. It's the same thing, parallel. These are different locations you can go to. So when we talk about a ledger economy, I want you guys to think of this as if you're putting down concrete to build a city. You're putting concrete down to build a city, right? So you have like a main road, and you'll have like streets off of it. Now, living in the city is its own value add because of how much is already there, right? So over here you might have like houses. I don't even know how to like draw this out as a map, but like let's say you have like this type of housing. Maybe I'll just color code this. Let's say that blue circles are like residential housing, right? And then you can also say over here, we'll use green. And we'll say that like green squares is like commercial housing or something like this, right? Commercial property. Does that make sense to you guys? So, what's an example of like residential or consumer grade like property on a blockchain? Like what's a residency on a blockchain? Like if it was just like a person's one bedroom apartment or condominium. Yeah, what's the parallel there? I see some people typing. A wallet, yes, exactly. Fantastic. Anybody else was typing? Yep, okay, I see people agree with that. And yeah, I completely agree. Like a personal use wallet is like a personal use house. Does that make sense? And then when we talk about like what's a commercial property, what do we think about? I'll tell you, a DApp or a smart contract that lots of people are using. Does that make sense? Yep, thank you, Doc. Yeah, a DApp or something that lots of people use. So you can think of like restaurants, schools, churches, parks even. Does that make sense? Art galleries, right? Like an NFT DApp, right? Could be an art gallery. So you have all of these people that live in this city, and arguably when they're not just living for their own sake, they're going to engage with what's in their neighborhood, right? They're going to engage with what they have access to, right? Does everyone understand what I'm saying here? It's the variety of things inside this city that build the ledger economy. It's the variety of things. So it's not just the fact that, oh, we have this amazingly good like concrete system in place, right? Like, oh hey, everybody show up. We're gonna have the best concrete in the world. Our roads are gonna be so smooth. They're gonna be strong. They're gonna have wide lanes. They're gonna have turn signals. You know, they're gonna have crosswalks that always can just automatically sense when someone's standing there. You know what I mean? They're gonna have they're gonna have gutters that never get clogged. They're not gonna have the clown down in the sewer killing people, right? Yeah, right. But in order for people to actually want to care about this amazing infrastructure, they need to have something that kind of like builds the reinforcement of them using it. Does that make sense? Like, imagine that you had a friend that lived somewhere else in that neighborhood, right? Like, imagine you had a friend that you want to regularly visit. Now, is it enough for you and that friend to both move to a different city if the road between you guys had a speed limit that's slightly higher? Does that make sense? Like, let's say it took you 5 minutes to drive to your friend's house, but if you guys both moved to another state, it could take 3.5 minutes to drive there, right? Granted, it's way easier to do this on blockchain than in real life, but this is arguably the hang up, or I guess you could say like what we think about with infrastructure for a ledger economy, right? Again, the stuff that actually gets built on a smart chain ends up being the restaurants. I'll tell you something. New York City has so many restaurants. New York City, you will never run out of restaurants. I hear that they have like something like 50 restaurants opening every day in New York City. Is that crazy? Like, you could not eat at 50 restaurants every day. Does that make sense? So therefore, like, you could spend your entire life in there, eat at restaurants 3 times a day, and you would never have in fact ate at all restaurants in New York City. Did you guys know that? Did you guys know that? It's crazy because the restaurant game is vicious there, but in fact, this is how it works. The fact of the matter is, I want you guys to know something about New York City. Driving places sucks. Yeah, driving places sucks. In fact, in order to get around, you gotta go downstairs into the basement and then go to this greasy fucking subway where they got homeless people camping, and then literally you go there and it's like plastic cafeteria benching, and you're like, well, at least I'm going someplace cool. Does that make sense? And you're always just like huddled with a bunch of other people. Does that make sense? It's certainly not to the point where 2 people in New York, if they live 5 minutes away from each other, they wouldn't be like, hey, let's go move to fucking Bozeman, Montana. Our commute to each other's houses would be so much better. Electronic, you know what? I actually live outside of Austin. Just outside. Just outside. Yeah, but I understand exactly that idea. I would say that it's not nearly what New York City managed to do, though. Yeah, like Austin, yeah. They're still able to like block roads off in Austin every weekend. Yeah, 6th Street gets blocked off every weekend. You could never do that in New York City. Yeah, and also in New York City, all the buildings are like 7 times as tall as they are here, right? Like the short ones are. So there's just way more business happening in a single city block. Does that make sense? Yeah. Electronic, I'll have you know that we're going to put a bunch of stickers around Austin very soon, and we'll also be turning that into more content. So you know what? If we happen to attract enough people through Austin with this sticker campaign, maybe we will do a Pyreswap Austin meetup. But yeah, not yet. But the fact of the matter is, you guys, I think Tendai or something was saying Ethereum layer 2s. Tendai, I agree with you because I think that just because you see a lot of people doing the same thing, the success rate of you doing it after they're already doing it, like you copycatting them, it becomes more and more of a red ocean. You have more and more people competing to kind of add the same value, and what you're going to end up doing is you're going to just keep slicing the pie thinner. Does that make sense? It's better to invent something and create a demand for it in the long term. At least that's what we did with Pyreswap, right? Make sense, everybody? Right? Invent something, create a demand for it, because that is something that effectively shifts the paradigm and in fact creates new ways to perceive this. So the fact of the matter is, every time a new blockchain is launched, they don't really inherit the same commercial properties. Does that make sense? Like McDonald's is a restaurant that's in a lot of cities, right? Would you guys agree that McDonald's, if you even want to call it a restaurant, is in a lot of cities? I would say probably thousands of cities. Do you guys understand this? Would you prefer I say Denny's? I'm pretty sure McDonald's is the one that everybody knows, right? Okay. Just because a McDonald's launches over there, it doesn't mean it's the same McDonald's in your old town. Does that make sense? Like, they have to hire new people. They have to get their shit together. Does that make sense? Like, just because a McDonald's is there now doesn't mean that, like, the rest of New York is going to show up too. Does that make sense? Thank you for posting that McDonald's ad in chat. I think that really helped bring the idea together of what it means. I appreciate it a lot. That is, in fact, yes. Trigger Happy, you nailed it. Yeah. He is, in fact, the doctor of McDonald's. Okay, guys. So when we talk about a ledger economy, understand that every chain is like a new city being built. Does that make sense? And what they're building before they have buildings is they're building the roads and the highways and the train stops. Does that make sense? They're building the connection pieces. And they're focusing a lot on making the concrete good, making the gutters good, making the sidewalks good. And I don't disagree. Sorry, I use like triple negative there. I agree that there is value to infrastructure, because the fact of the matter is that, like, if there's a bunch of potholes in your roads, driving there does suck. Does that make sense? And then a certain amount of people do hate being there because of how bad driving sucks. For me, I don't really like New York City because driving sucks there. Like, it just sucks. There's never a day where you're not in gridlock traffic. Like, all hours of the day, I think maybe between like midnight and 3 a.m. is like not gridlock every single place. People also, if they need to, like, you know, stop the car, they'll just pull it over like 2 lanes away from the curb because the curb is all jammed up too. And they're like, yep, I'm gonna put my hazards on and we're gonna move this couch real quick. And that's how New York works, right? And everybody's kind of like, they'll either go around the block or they'll, don't even get me started there. But anyways, this is the ledger economy here, right? Does that make sense? So every time a new future city launches, which is arguably how these new layer 2 launches are, or these new chain launches in general, it's sort of like hearing about a new futuristic city being built in the desert, right? Do you guys remember when Saudi Arabia was going to build that city that was a fucking wall? Do you guys know what I'm talking about? That meme city? Well, it turns out like they didn't, you know? They're like, hey, we're going to make it 80% shorter after thinking about it again. Because it was great for publicity, but then it's like, wait a minute. Isn't this really stupid to have the fact that using 3 dimensions for a city makes a lot more sense? Do you guys get what I'm saying? Like, the fact that not everybody is stuck in an east to west paradigm. You can also go north and south, northwest and southeast, right? You guys get what I'm saying? You can fit things. It's more convenient to have things, you know, cities more blob shaped than they are bar shaped. But anyways, infrastructure for an economy, like, I'm now going to talk about Phantom and Sonic, okay? I think I've laid down some ground fundamentals around this idea for talking about Phantom and Sonic. And does everyone know what chains I'm referring to? Now, Phantom Opera was a project launched a few years ago, and it was, I think, very famous for its little DeFi era because it had a lot of experimental DeFi on it. And it was run by an organization called the Phantom Foundation. Yeah, literally that city right there. But I don't even know what that is. A lot of dApps have been built on Phantom. Does that make sense? Now, not a lot of these dApps are still around anymore. In fact, a huge infrastructure problem was caused by multi-chain collapsing for Phantom, right? But the fact of the matter is, people already live in Phantom. People already live at Phantom. Does that make sense? There's already an economy there at Phantom. Do you guys get what I'm saying? When you launch a new chain, you're effectively going to create hype around the road you built, and what you're doing is you're putting a parade on that road. Does that make sense? You're going to start a launch marketing thing, and the fact of the matter is that you need enough people there basking in the greatness of the road you just built to decide that they're going to completely uproot things that they have built in other cities and then plant them there as well. Does that make sense? So this would be like if the mayor of New York decided that New York had failed and he was going to build a new city next to New York, and he wanted everybody to move to this island. I mean, granted, that's kind of what people do, but New York is not close. Thank you for having the mayor of New York actually on the meme, on the GIF. Shout out to that guy, by the way. Yeah, truly a legend in New York mayor history. Yeah, right up there with Boss Tweed, if you ask me. Actually, that guy was Albany, wasn't he? But, no, I think Boss Tweed was New York or Brooklyn or something like that. Damn, that's a rat on the subway. That's so funny. Okay, so the fact of the matter is, now, what does it take for a city to not become a ghost town? Right? Have you guys ever been to like towns that they were boom towns? Do you guys know what a boom town is? I'm so glad that we can just keep referencing 19th century American history, by the way. Like, just the fact that we can just keep doing this again and again. Oh, Detroit. There you go. Mining towns. Yes, Detroit is a good one. Yeah, mining towns. It's funny that they're mining towns, aren't they? It's almost like there's a parallel there again to blockchains. That's so crazy. Is this a dream? Is this real? Chad, is this real? Yeah. Mining, Detroit, trade. Yeah. So what happens? Like, what happens to a boom town? Who here can, well, I guess LA is still there. I mean, New York is not a boom town either, you know what I mean? But Electronic, have you ever seen a city, perhaps in Tennessee and Kentucky, these are very, very common, where effectively there was a mine that was found. There was a mine, like a coal mine or an iron mine. They found a vein of coal or iron or something. Therefore, a mining company opens up and it creates a whole bunch of jobs there, right? It'll employ like thousands of people, and the workers will all just be miners. Does that make sense? So there'll be one town, and it's a company town almost. Well, sometimes it is. And effectively, there's a gold rush effect where a whole bunch of people move there. Does that make sense? A whole bunch of people move there with the expectation that they're going to be like 20 years of mining, but then the mine dries up. The mine dries up. Right? And if the mine dries up, yeah, the boom town is a bust town. Does that make sense? And what happens to bust towns is normally pretty depressing, because I think right now to this day, bust towns still exist. And do you guys know what they export? Crystal methamphetamine. Okay? That's what their economy is based around. Do you guys need me to explain that? My producer is enjoying that, but it's almost not funny because of how funny it is. Yeah, like that's true. That's real America. Do you guys understand me? The economy just starts making meth. What else do they got going on there? They got a Dollar General and a Denny's. Right? So, I want you guys to be careful when you see new chain launches and make sure that it's not a boom town. Because the fact of the matter is, what does a chain need to not go through a boom town, bust town cycle? It needs enough dApps and it needs enough residents. Does that make sense? It needs enough people that continue to like it. They like it for more than just the parade you threw when you first opened it. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? Because that is human nature, right? Now, right now, it almost looks to me as if the organization formerly known as the Phantom Foundation is trying to turn Phantom Opera into a bust town, and for some reason, I guess, move permanently to Sonic, right? I want you guys to understand something. In order for a ledger economy to sustain itself, it doesn't need, what it doesn't need is like it doesn't need a foundation. Does that make sense? It doesn't need like an oversight board or anything like that. It needs actors playing, let's call it this way. It needs infrastructure players. And it needs instrument players. Do you guys understand what I mean when I say infrastructure players and instrument players? Who here does not understand what I mean? Because this here actually involves a concept I didn't introduce yet. Or I did introduce it, but last week. We're still here. The camera is just, I think the camera is having a, we did that for dramatic effect. Yes, welcome back. Yes, you can now continue using the full portion of your seat. Indeed. Infrastructure players and instrument players. They need people that are playing the validation game. Does that make sense? Like there is an incentive for the block validators where they either take their staked amounts, their electricity, or a combination of both to validate the chain. Or the instrument players are people who are trading the instrument. And the instrument is really what's necessary to transact on the block. Does that make sense? Both of these games effectively support each other. Does everyone understand what I'm saying? You do understand what I'm saying? Great. I want you guys to know something. There's something you can do to make both of these games more valuable, especially on a chain that supports smart contracts. Do you guys know what that is? Here. I'm going to write it in a new color. Electronic. I think it is very likely, by the way, Electronic, I think it is very likely that the Senor Circus will validate for Phantom Opera in the future, as well as probably every chain we build dApps on. I think it's very likely. Here, I'm going to cover the board while I write this. Okay, there it is, guys. You can build and launch dApps. Does that make sense to you guys? When you build and launch dApps, you are in fact supporting both of the games. Does that make sense to you guys? Because the fact of the matter is, the infrastructure players are getting rewarded in the instrument, and the instrument players are getting rewarded in the instrument becoming more valuable. Therefore, the infrastructure players are getting rewarded from what the instrument players are doing, and they're both getting rewarded from the people who are using dApps, building dApps, and repeatedly using dApps. So first of all, I want you guys to understand something. Even in a microcosm, even if we have less than 50 daily users right now, we have people that are literally repeatedly using Pyreswap multiple times a day. Does anyone disagree with that? Does anyone disagree with that? We have people that are moved into this town. Does that make sense? They are not moving out of this town. Why are they not moving out of this town? Do you guys understand? Phantom is not going to become a bust town, okay? If you want to remember any part of this video, I swear to you that the Phantom Opera is not going to become a bust town because it has the world's first decentralized credit union built on it, okay? This means something. Maybe you don't understand what it means yet, but the fact of the matter is that this dApp, the glimpse you're seeing of it right now in phase 1, is just a fraction of its power. When I think about the work that I need to do in front of me as far as evangelizing what we've built here, I think that it had to have been way harder for Satoshi Nakamoto, okay? Like Satoshi Nakamoto, there was no paradigm at all. Wallet address, MetaMask, he did not have all that shit going for him, right? EVM, Block Explorer, Solidity, he did not have all that shit going for him. Does that make sense to you guys? So we right now are already showing you guys that we are supporting the instrument, which is the token FTM, right? The gas coin. And we're also supporting the blockchain, the FTM scan part, if you will, right? The chain in the back end, in the deep back end, that we're driving around when we click the transfer epoch button, or the max swap button, or the swap button, or the mead button. Do you guys understand? We're using the infrastructure. We're going to work. Does that make sense to you guys? We have created the idea that people are showing up to the IWV almost like they're punching in for a shift at their job. Am I making sense to you guys? This is Theory Thursday, but I want you guys to understand that all this theory I'm teaching you has direct application to what we're doing here. Do you guys understand? I don't want to FUD Sonic Labs, but the fact of the matter is that the parallel that I draw between what they're doing now, I think about when Do Kwon was trying to relaunch Terra Luna. And there are still people validating the original Terra. Does that make sense? They just continue to validate Terra Luna Classic. Do you guys understand? Because there was already a community built there. So therefore, like, even with the instruments being broken, let's put it this way. There's a lot of money you can make in a junkyard if you know where to look. Does that make sense? And I don't think that is I don't think it's a widespread enough belief when it comes to these chain builders. In fact, you know, lots of people collect old things just for nostalgia. Right? Like old video games, old coins for me, right? Antiques, right? There's a value to the fact that they lasted. How would that make sense to you guys? There's a value to the fact that, like, what they were at that moment of time still hasn't been reproduced. Not really with that same attitude, not really with that same, the same craftsmanship, perhaps. And I want you guys to understand that, yeah, like I insist that Pyreswap and the GPSE is not just one dApp, right? With a trio of tomb forks, it's actually 4 dApps per chain. Do you guys understand that? The GPSE per chain, if you remember that green squares are dApps, we are multiple dApps per chain. There might even be more dApps per chain, maybe in later phases. But Pyreswap is the type of dApp that doesn't need to chase the hype of a new chain launch. Does that make sense? Like, we know what our value add is, and we don't need some type of like hype authority determining our value. Like, we do that all by ourselves. And that pertains to any chain we ever build on. Well, let's see. Does anyone have any questions? What I can talk about here again is I can talk about the infrastructure game and the instrument game. I should probably change the color of one of these. Now these 5x5 grids are in fact game theory matrices, and they represent the total amount of sentiments, or really the possible classifications of sentiment that I can actually sit for this too, but I'm still in frame. The total possible classifications of sentiment that a player can have, and when we refer to these matrices, we want people to understand that they are multiplayer games. But generally speaking, the 5 total positions are bearish impossible, bullish possible, neutral, bearish possible, and bullish impossible. And these 5 almost in a tier represent the total amount of bullishness or bearishness that a person can have at any given moment. Sorry, I'm just checking to make sure I'm writing in a place you guys can see. And this might not be completely legible, but again, the most bullish you can be is to be bearish impossible. Does that make sense? Like at any given point, it is impossible for you to be bearish. Examples of these people would be Michael Saylor. Does that make sense to you guys? Right? Like Michael Saylor, it's like he's not like ever reducing his exposure. Does that make sense? You know, probably Pompliano would be another good guy. Anybody you know that's like all in. So like think of any Bitcoin influencer. I'm thinking of Bitcoin right here, but this does apply to chains besides Bitcoin, but I think that Bitcoin was the best to provide theoretics for how it being true. Then you have bullish possible people. And bullish possible people can also be neutral or bearish possible. Does that make sense? Because if it's possible for them to be bullish, it also implies that it's possible for them, it's also possible for them to be something besides bullish. Does that make sense? So you have the majority of the market movement comes from these people between 2, 3, and 4, right? So Bitcoin summer and Bitcoin winter, these are the people that have the ability to either be bullish possible or bullish impossible. They're either buying or they're selling. Does that make sense? Like their own time preference is just one cycle. Does that make sense? They want to either pump it and then fucking dump it. Does that make sense? And then you have bullish impossible people. Now, bullish impossible people don't really matter to market movement, but you can think of like people like Christine Lagarde or like Jerome Powell or like central bankers or Warren Buffett. Does that make sense? Like it doesn't really matter what they think. They're just not really inside the Web3 economy. They're not playing the Web3 game, as it were. So I want you guys to understand an infrastructure game and an instrument game can always last as long as you're meeting a quorum of bearish impossible people. Does that make sense? People who are always willing to continue playing the game. Does that make sense? So like at any price, they can't be bearish. I want you guys to understand, we also built an intergame in Pyreswap. And I want you guys to understand, if you're looking at our Discord community, I want you guys to understand that even on red candle days where Bitcoin's crashing and it's dragging the rest of crypto down, we still have quite a bit of people that are bearish impossible about Pyreswap and the GPSC. Am I making sense to you guys? Like there's always this foundational amount of people that once they have really wrapped their head around this, they don't switch around to being bullish possible. They're locked in at bearish impossible. Do you guys understand? Like they can't waver anymore. Like maybe they have certain complaints on some days and certain days they don't. But like overall, they're bearish impossible because they've either seen enough or they've learned enough to be bearish impossible. Bullish possible people are the people that they don't really understand it, but they perhaps are attracted to it for a superficial reason, or they're short term, or you name it. Those people do have the ability to cause drastic amounts of change in a short amount of time, because that is the herd. Does that make sense? The herd is that lives between here and 2, 3, and 4. Does that make sense? The leaders, right? The leaders, they in Web3 at least, they're the ones that are bearish impossible or arguably bullish impossible, right? Those people are leaders, right? But the people who aren't leaders, they end up wavering between these 2, 3, and 4. And they are what caused the market to behave a certain way, right? If you look at a meme coin and you see the chart get extremely bullish and then go extremely bearish, it's because there was a stampede of people through there, but they weren't exactly, let's just say they weren't necessarily exactly leaders. They were looking for something to follow because they weren't either not sure of themselves or that's just what their tendencies are. When we talk about the infrastructure game and the instrument game, I want you guys to understand that there's people that are bullish on the infrastructure of Bitcoin. Does that make sense? Like the people that continue mining Bitcoin, they mine it because they can now see again and again and again that more and more blocks keep getting mined. Does that make sense? Like they just keep seeing that the network uptime is amazing. And because they see more people mining it, they're even more bullish about mining it. In fact, they start competing over who gets the rewards from mining blocks. Does that make sense? And the more people competing for that, that kind of implies that the instrument will become more valuable. Does that make sense? Because anybody who's mining the chain is creating a demand for the coin. Do you guys understand that? Because anybody mining it, it implies they're interested in acquiring Bitcoin, right? Granted, when you mine Bitcoin right now, the Bitcoin you acquire is seigniorage Bitcoin, meaning it's minted, it's newly released Bitcoin. But the fact of the matter is that the reason they're interested in that Bitcoin at that price is because Bitcoin you could get out on the free market has gone up. Does that make sense? So the amount of people driving the infrastructure game are what kind of seed the instrument game. Does that make sense? It plants a seed for that. People later, they can trade the instrument speculatively based on almost what its future demand would be, right? But at the same time, if you want to think about what's going to increase the demand for infrastructure and the instrument, it's going to be applications. And I don't mean dApps even on smart chains. I mean like use cases, right? So use cases for Bitcoin also drive its demand up. Because every new use case creates a new lens through which to view the whole project. Does that make sense? So when we talk about what's the use cases of wood, well, you can use wood to build furniture. You can use wood to build a case for a stereo speaker. You can use wood to build a chess set. You can use wood to frame a house. You can use wood to build a campfire. Does that make sense? And all of these things drive the demand for wood because they're different lenses through which the value of wood can be analyzed. The same is true of blockchains and crypto instruments. It's the people who are bearish impossible on Bitcoin that cause its support. Does that make sense? So every time crypto goes through a new cycle, you'll notice that the lows keep climbing up. Does that make sense? Do you guys notice the lows keep climbing up? The lows climbing up imply that more and more people are getting converted to bearish impossible. Does that make sense? Because more and more people are less scared. Do you guys understand? Because they now begin to be converted themselves. Infrastructure game, it's the same concept. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed the Pyreswap show. I have nothing else to talk about today. If there's no more questions, I don't see any. Thank you. If there's no questions or no more comments, I encourage you guys to, first of all, I'd love it if you guys all went to our newest YouTube video where we demonstrated active staking. And if you guys could give that a thumbs up or write a good comment or share it or whatever, that would be great. For those of you watching this show, you are encouraged to come to our Discord. You can find our Discord on our website, pyreswap.com. It's in the footer of every single page. Any questions you have about what we're talking about here, general chat, this is all we talk about. It's great, honestly. Thank you guys so much for coming. And I'm going to do my little salute here. Have a great rest of your day.